أخيا ورتل القرآن اصبح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان
فؤاد كالحجارة قسوة فإذا عن القرآن حين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم صل على جميع أنبياء الله ورسله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in our series Reflections on the Quran. There was a couple of loose ends remaining from our previous episode. We're discussing in the context of Asbabun Nuzul, the circumstances that were the cause for the revelation of particular verses of the Quran. This famous story that is sometimes referred to as the Satanic Verses gave the name to Salman Rushdie's infamous novel, Satanic Verses. And this story was circulating, it was floating around in the time of the Tabi'een, and Imam al-Tabari mentioned a number of narrations, isnads, for this basic story that the Prophet ﷺ was reciting Surah An-Najm, and when he got to the verse that says, have you considered Lat and Uzza and Manat? These were names of three of the goddesses that the Meccans worshipped. Then supposedly he inserted, or Satan in one version, imitating his voice, inserted this verse that said, they are high-flying swans whose intercession is to be hoped for. And, you know, there is so many indicators of people tweaking this story in order to... the story reaches somebody and they tweak it in order to make it somehow less troubling. There's one version where the Prophet ﷺ was sleeping beside the Kaaba and he's reciting these verses halfway asleep. There's clearly some kind of editorial process going on here in some of these versions of the story. Now, we said that the great majority of Muslim scholars reject the authenticity of these narrations. Some of them are outright weak in the sense that there are weak narrators in the isnads. Some of them, the isnads, have narrators that are reliable, but they don't connect to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. They end with the tabi'een, the generation after the companions. And therefore, this reliable scholar from the tabi'een, he heard it from someone, and he didn't tell us who he heard it from. And it could very well be another tabi'i that he heard it from. And we mentioned that Ibn Hajar, in his survey of hadith isnads, he mentioned that sometimes you'll have as many as 6 or 7 tabi'is in an isnad. So the fact that the tabi'i didn't mention who he heard it from, it cannot be assumed that he heard it from a sahabi and he just dropped the name. Now, scholars like Ibn Kathir, Bayhaqi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Arabi, Qadi Iyad, there's quite a long list of major scholars who rejected this story as false. To be fair, it should be mentioned that Ibn Hajar, who is a great hadith scholar, is called Al-Hafiz when it comes to hadith. He said, well, you know, you have 3 or 4 isnads that end with different tabi'een. So the dictates of hadith science say that these narrations support each other to the extent that there must be some basis to the story. Now, if we look at what Orientalists have said about this story, they too are divided. There are Orientalists like John Burton and Caetani. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. I've never heard it pronounced. It starts with a C, but he's Italian, so maybe it's Caetani. And I mean, his name reminds me of a story. When a new Muslim came to, Muslim who didn't speak Arabic, came to the Islamic University of Medina, and he was being checked into the hostel, and the man who was trying to help him didn't speak any English or whatever language this guy spoke. And he said something, and this guy could understand a little bit of Arabic, and he misunderstood what the man was saying, and he got angry. And so then the Arab, he said, "Aradtu shaytani." This is the Arabs today. They don't quite pronounce their language as it was pronounced in the classical era. And so he changed the tha, shaythani. I meant something else. Literally, I meant a second thing. So he said, "Aradtu shaytani." And this new Muslim or foreigner, he thought he was saying shaitan. So he said, "Anta shaitan, you're the shaitan, I'm not the shaitan." Anyway, so the Italian Orientalist, whose name is either Caetani or Chaitani, his conclusion was that the story is false. Now, John Burton, he's an Orientalist who has made the Muslim scholars' concept of abrogation or naskh the particular specialization of his studies. So he's written quite a few works on naskh. He actually did the translation of a book on naskh by one of the early scholars of Islam, and then he wrote an introduction to it. Anyway, he also wrote an article particularly about this verse that supposedly was the cause for the revelation of the passage in Surah Al-Hajj where it mentions that whenever a prophet or a messenger recites, that Satan casts something into his recitation. So the way that Burton explained it, he said, yeah, these stories, they don't add up, His conclusion is that these narrations are false. But from that, he made a conclusion that we would definitely not agree with. He said that Imam al-Tabari made these narrations up in order to provide evidence to support the Muslim jurist's concept of abrogation, that some verses of the Quran abrogate others. Now, it's true that some scholars did refer to this incident as somehow having a relationship to the juristic concept of abrogation of one Quranic verse by another, but that's quite a far-fetched and weak basis for establishing the concept that Allah causes one rule in a verse in one passage in the Quran to be canceled by a later rule of the Quran itself. This whole incident has nothing to do with that. The other reason that we would reject Burton's accusation of Imam al-Tabari is that Imam al-Tabari was a renowned scholar, and his contemporaries had no doubts about his character. I mean, he was an upright scholar. And so for a man like that to fabricate these stories is far-fetched, because every scholar knows that the Prophet ﷺ, he said that if somebody attributes something to me falsely, let him be prepared to take his place in the hellfire. And this particular incident is attributing something way beyond a normal fabricated hadith to the Prophet ﷺ. It's saying that he inserted something in the Quran that was not from Allah. And the Quran itself says, وَلَوْ تَقَوَّلَ عَلَيْنَا بَعْضَ الْأَقَاوِيلِ لَأَخَذْنَاهُ بِالْيَمِينِ ثُمَّ لَقَطَّعْنَا مِنْهُ الْوَتِينَ. If the Prophet ﷺ, Allah says, if he had fabricated something regarding us, meaning the revelation, brought something that was revelation, claiming it was revelation, was not, Allah said we would have seized him by his right hand and then cut off his jugular vein. So in other words, he would have died on the spot. So obviously that didn't happen. So it's inconceivable that Imam al-Tabari would have had the audacity to attribute something like this to the Prophet ﷺ just because he felt like it. And the other reason that we would reject that accusation is that Imam al-Tabari wasn't the only person who collected these narrations. His contemporary, hadith scholar named al-Bazzar, he narrated the same incident. Oh, it's time for a break.
Pearls of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Abu Huraira, may Allah be pleased with him, reported Allah's Messenger, may peace be upon him, as saying, he who treads the path in search of knowledge, Allah would make that path easy, leading to paradise for him. Sahih Muslim, Volume 4, Book of Remembrance of Allah, Hadith number 6518.
The children of Islamic International School. Different, outstanding, extraordinary.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says,
if Allah helps you, none can overcome you.
There is no God worthy of worship except Allah.
Allow the Quran to come into life. It will enlighten you.
Islamic International School inculcates excellent educational goals and achievements.
Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said,
best amongst you is the one who learns the Quran and imparts its knowledge to others. Islam will enter everywhere.
For the best in this world as well as hereafter.
This book is answering all your problems. The glorious Quran is the solution of problems of humanity.
Watch Khadija Sayyed, Yusuf Serran, Ayman Ansari, Ahmad Sorakia, Nabiha Khan, Naif Ansari, Zahra Patanwala, Arsh Zagare, Ghazi Chauhan and Farik Naik.
Allah is giving us an opportunity to do a prophet's job and to earn a prophet's reward.
Watch Guides of the Islamic International School speak on challenging topics in Promising Generation every Saturday at 7:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 10:30 a.m. UK on Peace TV. Their advice,
who was raised under the banner of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah.
Their guidance,
their foundation is based on the Quran and the teaching of the Messenger of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Their example,
when the sun is above the heads of the people.
Saeed Raghi,
this young man or young lady, on the day of Yawm al-Qiyamah, they will be under that shade, the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Going in the divine direction, blessing of Allah, the world of Muslim youth. Next on Peace TV.
Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, welcome back. So we're talking about these so-called satanic verses and the incident that has been recorded in the tafsir of Imam al-Tabari and in some other hadith books, and why it is implausible that Imam al-Tabari fabricated the incident. Because his contemporary al-Bazzar, who was a reputable hadith scholar, he also collected these narrations. And when somebody makes an accusation like that, it really reflects some missing element in their understanding of the intellectual environment of the time. These circles of hadith transmission were widespread in the Muslim land, and particularly in Baghdad, which was the center of the Muslim civilization. It was the capital of the Abbasid state, and it was the center to which anybody who had a real aspiration for learning, they tended to gravitate to this spot. And people really, really were up on the narrations of various scholars. So when you read about the capsule biographies of this scholar or that, sometimes you'll see references to where he had a different wording slightly from a well-known hadith, and people would come to him and say, your version of this hadith is different from everybody else's. Why? So this kind of awareness of who had narrated what and who was the student of who, this was like a matter that the scholars of the time were deeply concerned about, because they wanted to make sure how much weight to put on a person's narrations of hadith. So for somebody to just come with all of these narrations out of thin air that nobody's ever heard of before is quite far-fetched. Now, what are we to make then? Okay, if we say that this story is false, then what is the meaning of that verse in Surah Al-Hajj? What does it mean that shaitan casts something into the recitation of a prophet? That passage goes on to mention that this process of shaitan's involvement is a cause, it's a trial for those in whose hearts there is sickness and those whose hearts are hardened. So an alternative explanation to the role of shaitan in this whole process is not that he tampers with the wording of the revelation, but that he whispers in the minds of those who are the opponents of the prophets. And they come up with these interpretations of what those verses mean, which involves some kind of misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding is motivated not only by shaitan, but from their own internal opposition to the basic idea that they should submit themselves to somebody outside of themselves. So they look at these verses of the Quran, they look at these passages, and they interpret them in a way whereby they can say, look at this. This is clearly a mistake. Or this part contradicts with this part. And so by having these misunderstandings, straws to clutch at, then they can justify to themselves why it is that they're not submitting to that message. So that was some of the leftovers from the last episode that we did. Now, this whole issue of revelation and abrogation of some verses, Quranic verses, by others, that was another issue that we referred to earlier when we were talking about one of the things that the Sahaba, one of their contributions to the field of tafsir, Quranic commentary, that they're the only ones who can really tell us, oh, there was this verse and then this verse altered it or affected the scope of the rule that's contained in it. And so this brings us to the topic of naskh, or abrogation. Now, this is a concept which has been, to a certain extent, controversial down through the history of Islamic scholarship. And the dominant opinion among scholars is that abrogation did occur in the Quran and in the Sunnah. But there's always been a minority opinion that rejected the concept with regard to the Quran in particular. Not really with regard to the Sunnah. There's a real small minority that objects also to the idea of abrogation in the Sunnah. But with regard to abrogation in the Quran, there are some who rejected it in classical Islamic history. They were always a minority. The most famous one by name is Abu Muslim al-Isfahani, who I believe was 5th century, and he was a Mu'tazilite scholar, a judge in Isfahan. And he wrote a tafsir of the Quran which is now lost, in which he discussed those issues. However, his views, they've been captured and transmitted by other scholars, probably not in the same detail as he himself presented them. So Abu Muslim rejected the entire idea that there is verses of the Quran whose rules have been canceled. And over the course of time, there's also been a tremendous amount of disagreement among jurists and among scholars of tafsir as to which particular verses have been abrogated. There are some who claim that the number of abrogated verses was in the hundreds, 200 or 300, and that's quite an outrageous claim, really. A scholar like Imam as-Suyuti came along and he looked at all of the verses that somebody claimed had been abrogated by some other verse, and he concluded that there were only 21 that have been abrogated. Shah Waliullah Dahlawi, who was, I think, roughly around the 17th century, a great scholar from India, he looked at Suyuti's 21 verses, and he concluded there were only 5 that have been abrogated, actually. Abrogated in the sense that there's nothing left of the original rule, that this rule contained in this verse is completely, 100% inoperative, and it's not allowed to base an action upon it after that. Just to pull back a little bit and look at linguistically what's the meaning of the word nasakh. It comes from the verb nasakha yansukhu, which means to erase or obliterate. So the usual example that they give is mentioning that the wind will obliterate footprints in sand, or that the sun obliterates shade. So once the sun shines on that spot that was in the shade, there's no shade anymore. And a technical definition of nas is the cancellation of a Sharia rule by a Sharia text revealed after the text that established the rule. And there are works that were composed specifically on this topic starting as early as the Tabi'een. Qatada ibn Di'ama was a major scholar among the younger Tabi'een, and there's a book attributed to him, although he died before books were written down. So his particular book was not written by him. He was blind anyway, but it clearly wasn't written in his lifetime. But his students memorized his statements, and then either his student or a student of his student wrote it down at some later time. And he doesn't talk at all about the theory of abrogation. He just says, oh, okay, this verse was abrogated by this one, this verse was abrogated by this one, like that. So scholars wrote about nas. They began composing works about nas very early. And some of the works about nas contain a narration attributed Ali radiallahu anh, that he saw a man in the masjid giving a religious talk. Now, there were a lot of people in masjids that would give like storytelling kind of talks, things to make people feel good or inspire them to be better Muslims. So, according to this narration, Ali asked this man, do you know the nasikh of the Quran and the mansukh? And the man said, no. So, nasikh means the abrogating, mansukh means the abrogated. So this man said, no, I don't. So Ali told him, halakta wa ahlak. You have destroyed yourself and destroyed others. And then in some versions, he told the man, stop giving talks in the masjid. Now what's important to know about this is that the Sahaba understood the word naskh in a much broader sense than the later technical definition. So we'll talk about that in the next episode, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Wallahu a'lam.
اقرأ أخيا ورتل القرآن اصدح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان
true and faithful servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
وجوه يومئذ ناظرة. Some faces in the day of resurrection will beam in brightness.
Their qualities, their characteristics.
الذين آمنوا. Those who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وتطمئن قلوبهم بذكر الله.
Sheikh Saeed Al-Ghadi.
And their hearts find tranquility and rest by remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Can we be one of them?
Indeed, by remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hearts find rest and tranquility.
Welcome to a brand new series, The Servants of Allah,
Hisham Bella,
which inshallah ta'ala will focus on those issues which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves.
Let's learn how and what gains us the favor and pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Servants of Allah, every Thursday at 4:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 3:30 a.m. UK on Peace TV. Thursdays provide.
In Britain, we are facing one big problem, that are you Muslim or British?
The space to talk.
In India, back home, they ask, are you a Muslim first or Indian first? And we Muslims should know how to reply, how to turn the tables over.
The place to knock.
Why Trinity cannot be regarded in that sense, Father, Son and Holy Spirit?
The opportunity to ask.
But even if we agree that what the Christians say, that he was crucified, so if Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, died for 3 days, who controlled the world? That means even God died?
The freedom to unmask.
So there are various ways which we can prove the argument to be wrong.
Let's meet Dr. Zakir every Thursday at 6:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 9:30 a.m. UK on Peace TV.
Scientific notions in the glorious Quran are among its endless aspects that can testify for the divine nature of this noble book. These scientific notions are probably the best addressed to the people of our time. I am Zaghlul Al-Najjar. Please join me in this program to discuss some aspects of the scientific notions in the glorious Quran.
سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق.
I created the universe.
Appreciate the word-to-word authenticity of scientific notions and proven facts mentioned in the glorious Quran 1400 years ago in Scientific Notions in the Glorious Quran. Every Saturday at 8 p.m. and repeat telecast at 8:30 a.m. UK on Peace TV.